Okay. Well, we just introduced ourselves. Melinda, I'm Stefana Johnson, and I'm a clinician over in the Arizona, in Gilbert, Arizona, like the Phoenix area. And I've been part of the development team from the beginning of our project here. So always super excited to share. And then we got Brian on as well.
I'm here. I'm up in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I kind of work the northern Colorado area too. I'm a psychologist at the VA. I also work with Arise as part of the development team for CMI.
Yeah. So, being in the field, I've been in the field since 2001, in behavioral health, first as behavioral health tech and then as a therapist. But part of this whole project comes from some of the challenges that we faced, even in, after trying to learn every modality that we could. And I work a lot with complex trauma. So, and often before, for years, worked with court-ordered clients. And so, as you can imagine, those are like very, probably challenging populations that might not fit, the standard population that we treat in outpatient or in private practice. But this whole project started just because some of the challenges that we were seeing in our field, and a bunch of us came together and kind of have put together our wisdom and our experience and combined it with what we learn from not only our industry but also like neuroscience and trying to make better sense of things. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on today as we present CMI, and then we'll have some time at the end of probably, hopefully, at least 20 minutes just for questions and anything that you want that maybe we didn't catch during the presentation. So I want to start off with just some of the challenges that we were facing in therapy. And that, coming from first generation Hispanic American, like I'm a Mexican American, I think that even the way we conceptualize healing and therapy is very different from, the kind of the culture where I was immersed into. And so sometimes I see some of the approaches like where we would experience there was some disconnect, didn't quite connect with people or misattunement with the individual. Um, Feeling like some of the protocols are created and then we're trying to fit people into it. So all sizes into one fit instead of like a one size fits all, where it kind of accommodates the individual. So we'll go into this a little bit more so that we can kind of bridge it into how these questions kind of led us to the development of CMI. And then a lot of focus on alleviation versus growth. So we really look at trying to normalize rather than pathologize, some of these common mental health issues that we face. And the whole term of post-traumatic growth, is something that I find to be very valuable in our field. But oftentimes when we're just looking at eliminating symptoms, there's some limitations there. And then the dependence on the professional as the expert. So breaking that down a little bit further, when I talk about treatments feeling disconnected, I wanted to understand, or all of us wanted to understand, why is this that this happens? And oftentimes, at least at the beginning of my career, I was really trained heavily in like a CBT approach, cognitive interventions. I worked with juvenile sex offenders that had been adjudicated, and we taught them about thinking errors. You change your stinking thinking, and you've got to eliminate your behaviors by practicing new behaviors. And we structured the environment. It was a residential treatment environment, so of course we had a lot of control in that. But what I noticed is the moment that they left our organization, it's like they went back to some of the behaviors as if they hadn't even learned, the skills that they learned. And what we've learned over time, why it feels disconnected, is that every individual really looks at the world differently. Their perception of reality is very different for each individual because the lived experience is what creates these neural networks that kind of serve as reference points to define the world, define themselves, their part in the world, and everybody's individual based on how they grew up, their culture, all of these factors contribute to that. And their responses, before when I was like focusing on the way they think, the thought process is kind of the result of how they perceive and how they experience the world. And so these responses really come from a natural instinct of like our brain is kind of like a prediction machine, wants to understand the world. And so it goes based off of lived experience. So those patterns is what helps them navigate the present. And so the issue comes when we're trying to outcompete them, and they come from experiences, particularly trauma experiences. This is like trying to outthink your nervous system. And then with a lot of our approaches is, if any of you have really looked into research, we're doing like a research study where I practice right now, and I realize how difficult it is to even get a participant that meets the threshold, the criteria for being a part of the study. And so there are so many individuals that you probably would see come into your office that don't even make it into the research to the population that is actually researched. And so the scripts that are, I understand the value of that. We need to definitely have a way to like measure efficacy and make sure that we're not, doing any harm. But sometimes whenever an intervention results in like a specific script or protocol, it sometimes misses, a big chunk of the population, and so might not align with the patterns of the individual and how the individual functions. The other piece is when there's a misalignment with that. So let's say you're working with me and there's something that you're asking me to do and it doesn't match my experience or it doesn't match how I perceive or interpret the world, then it could feel like a disruption in our relationship. And that creates a sense of unsafety, maybe guardedness. And so this is where some of those challenges come in, because in order to feel safe, I have to feel like you see me, right? Honor my experience. And so these are some challenges that we face when it comes to disconnection. Same things that contribute to misattunement. So for an emotion to be expressed, requires like in a way that's safe and in control. There requires some safety, to feel safe with the individual. So especially when it comes to vulnerable emotions, we know a lot of our clients really struggle with um, demonstrating vulnerability. And so some of those disruptions that happen could cause kind of a stuck or a withdrawal. And it might not even be conscious on the client's part or on our part. But that does happen sometimes. I've had clients that come in and say, I didn't talk about this with anyone. And when I ask why, they said, well, my therapist wasn't ready to hear it. And so those type of things can happen whenever, there's no safety or the container in order to be able to explore these challenges that people face. And then sometimes with the attunement, whenever we have a protocol or a script that we're following and it does not align with the individual's experience, it disrupts that attunement, right? When we align with the individual rather than the protocol, it allows for that attunement, which enables that natural process of integrating experiences, exploring responses, and making those deep changes. And then the pace also can matter. So even, when we talk about CMI, some of the challenges we have kind of like the map of what you follow, but the pace has to be individualized. So one individual can go through the process pretty quickly within a matter of minutes, and other ones might need a matter of multiple sessions to get to the place where they can actually integrate a memory. So really that pace in the process has to be unique for the individual. If we're rushing them, it could feel jolting, it could feel disruptive in that connection with the clinician. And so these are some of the challenges that cause, misattunement. And then just really understanding that the answers to the individual's challenges, it lies within. And we know this, it's like ancient wisdom where we talk about the answers, like you hold the answers within you. Why? Because each of us is individual. We're different. In my experiences, the answers for you might not resonate or might not connect with my lifestyle or my experience or my history. And so that can cause misattunement as well, because a well-meaning clinician might say, well, just don't do this, or you got to ask for forgiveness, or you got to make that connection. And that might not be the right thing for the individual. And then the all sizes fits one when we're trying to follow a specific structure, and this is necessary, I understand, for fidelity purposes, right? When we use evidence-based modalities. But this was one of my challenges, is that I would have something that was very structured, and I'm noticing that this individual might not be ready for this step, but I didn't have instructions on how to modify it. It was like, this is how you do it, and this is how you stick to the fidelity. And patterns are not universal. We all have different ways of processing and experiencing the world. So that could be a challenge for really connecting with the individual. And not all protocols fit every individual. So I used to practice a protocol that really targeted images and how people they had to come up with a scene. Well, we have individuals who can't visualize. They don't, they have, there's a condition that does not allow some individuals to be able to visualize. And so that would be a challenge, right? So those are some of the things that when you have something that is built around a specific structure and the person doesn't fit that, this causes a disruption. And then the healing really is about connection, not standardization, right? And the connection between like our connection between individuals, but more importantly, the connection with the self. And we see this often in our field where an individual has a lot of, holds a lot of shame or self-hatred, or those are some of the things that are really difficult to work through with just cognitive approaches. Um, this connection really is key in terms of healing, and that really actually, really connects with integration. And then the target of how we view, and I kind of blame this on insurance because insurance wants us to say, hey, what is the thing and how do you know you're done, right? What is the problem? How do you know you're done? You got to have a way of measuring it. The issue is that a lot of times what we're targeting is just a symptom of a core, like a deeper rooted issue. And so when we're targeting just the relief versus the healing, it doesn't always connect. It doesn't always lead to long-term results. And I noticed this with the kids that we worked with. They changed the way they thought, so they said the right things, but then when push came to shove and a situation arose, they went back to old patterns. And then they feel bad that, when you know better, you should do better, but didn't quite like translate. Um, the other piece is we tend to, when we go through adversity, we want to like shove it in the back of the closet and not look at it because it's uncomfortable. Well, just because we shoved it back there doesn't mean it does not impact how we view the world, how we interact with others, our responses to situations. And so the integration of experience really is what we're missing whenever we're desensitizing. And not, sometimes it does integrate naturally, but in my experience, I'd have individuals where I used approaches and the maybe the nightmare stopped or the panic attack stopped, but then some of the behaviors continued. So like an individual that had been abused as a child, I had treated her when she was a child and her nightmares resolved, those things resolved. But as an adult, she came back to me and she said, I keep putting myself in situations where I get assaulted. And as we used CMI, it connected to that was her way of surviving as a child was to please and appease, right? Just go ahead and go with it. But unfortunately, that pattern was now shown up in adulthood when she's not 5 years old anymore. She has her own apartment, she has agency, she's able to walk away, but she didn't understand why she continued that pattern. So those are the areas where these things show up. Once we integrated it, that experience, rather than just desensitize, she was able to recognize other areas in her life where she's not setting those boundaries and actually follow through on setting some boundaries. Um, when we work on awareness, we can only access what we can recall, right? Like explicit memories. It's difficult to really access implicit memories. And so when we just work on awareness, but we don't know how to change or how to update the experience that's driving this response, it becomes kind of aimless. Now you're aware that you do this, but you don't know how to change it because oftentimes we're reacting to things. We're not always in the place where we're aware and intentional with our behavior. That takes a lot of energy, a lot of your body budget. And then the meaning making as well can change how we perceive an experience. But again, there's limitations because, I look at it shifting from meaning making together to helping the individual see themselves as the meaning maker. This is something that could be translated, they could do with any situation, that whether it's a trauma experience or not. And then, of course, all this can lead to dependence on the clinician. So, with previous approaches, I would have individuals that would come to me because they wanted to address a specific incident or event, and then they discharge, they face another adversity, and they immediately come back because they have a hard time, going through or remembering the tools to use because I was the one facilitating that rather than teaching them how to connect to themselves. And so this is the difference between, I call it outsight versus insight. Someone else is giving you the answers or guiding you through it versus you knowing where to look and how to connect to these things. And then being able to reclaim that personal choice, that requires an individual to trust themselves. And this is something that's really difficult for people with trauma, is to trust themselves. And so that's a lot of the things that we're addressing with CMI. We always identify the individual as the expert of their own journey, not us. We might be the expert of CMI or, of having all these different tools or approaches, but the individual is the only one that can access like where these issues are coming from. So now let's just connect the CMI approach. How does this address it? Because after we faced all these things and we look at why does this happen, it kind of guided us to what is it that we're looking for to resolve these things. And with the CMI approach, um, we're hoping that you'll see how all these things connected. But let's define really quick because it stands for critical memory integration. So what is a critical memory? So memory is an experience essentially that is recorded, right? It's data, and it can take all types of form. It could be implicit or explicit, meaning that sometimes you recall it, sometimes it's just stored in your body. It could be like your muscle memory or something like that. I use the example of walking. The explicit piece is like the memory that you learn how to walk and you can remember walking, but the implicit piece is the actual action of walking, right? You don't remember, a lot of people can't recall when they learned how to walk. They can't remember the experience of trying to stand on their two legs and falling, but they can recall, running and walking. So just some things that you can remember as actual events, those would be explicit, but there's a lot of experiences that you had, particularly those in early childhood, like before you turned, I think it's 3 3/4 where a long-term memory is formed, for the most part, that you're not going to recall explicitly, but they're still stored in there. So an example of that would be your attachment patterns, right? Sometimes you go through things early in life that impact how you attach, and you might not be aware of the impact of that because it lies beneath your conscious awareness. So a critical memory differentiates from just a regular memory. So you can think of what I had for breakfast yesterday as a memory, right? I can recall that information, but it might not really impact how I interact with the environment or the world unless I had something terrible and then I decide never to eat that again. But critical experiences are those that really define our development, like our attachment strategies, anything related to survival, or the formation or maintenance of relationships. So these are kind of like I call them policy procedure manuals of how the brain functions. And they don't necessarily have to be traumatic, right? So some of them are traumatic. Oftentimes traumatic memories become critical experiences, but sometimes it's just something in our life that we experience and we made our own meaning over it. And it controls everything. It dictates or limits us for the rest of our life. And we're not even aware that that happens. So a critical memory is different in the sense that it evokes a strong belief, intuition, emotion, or reaction with very little input from the conscious mind. So with most approaches, we're looking at things like emotions, right? And regulating those, or the thoughts, changing the thoughts, identifying beliefs, trying to change those beliefs, or targeting images or the narrative. Somatic approaches look at the nervous system responses. These are all aspects of a critical experience. It's not only one, there's multiple things, and all of them contribute to the experience. So, in mapping this out, you could see if I'm only targeting the image, the issue might be lying somewhere else in here, right? Or if I'm just going it from here, it's like something else might be missing. So whenever these experiences are integrated, what do we mean by that? Well, what I do matches who I am, and I'm at peace with that. So I always use myself as an example too, because I had a lot of anger issues as a kid because of my own trauma. So I was reactive. I would attack. I got in trouble, at school for being aggressive. That behavior and that way of functioning doesn't really bode well, right? As an adult, like you call to HR, it can cause a lot of problems in your life. And so also, I'm a caring person. I love people. So if my behavior does not match like who I am at the core, something feels incongruent, right? It's mismatched. And it can cause issues, not just in the way I interact in my relationships, but also how I feel about myself and how I interact, how I view the world, how I view my position in the world. And so when something is congruent, it's aligned. And that requires me to recognize why those behaviors at that time made sense. I was 5 years old, I was 10 years old, I didn't have the skills, But now I'm grown. Now I have a safe place to live in. Back then I didn't, or whatever it is, it's looking at the context. In order to do that, I have to be willing to be aware of those. I have to make connections to those. And if there's a trauma that we're trying to avoid and just shove back, that it inhibits the process of integration, right? So when we talk about integrated, it means that it's connected, it's aligned, there's context to it, and it's always an option on the table to respond that way, but you also have the freedom to respond a different way because you recognize this is coming from back there versus from right here. So this allows you to be fully present in this moment, congruent with yourself, aligned with who I am, and your capacities to navigate through stressful or adversity really increases because you feel like you're at the driver's seat, right? You're in control. Unintegrated experiences are those that are, and this is how CMI perceives like the treatments feeling disconnected. If what I do doesn't match who I am, instead of targeting like the thought process that's leading me to that behavior or trying to control my breathing or, and those things are all valuable skills, but we really want to get to the root of where this disruption happened, right? So for me, I might have had some of my CMI sessions might have connected to an early on experience of abuse where I could not protect myself. And so once I integrate that experience and my brain realizes, oh, after that age, I grew up and now I'm an adult and I can take care of that self. It sounds like parts work. That's why parts work works, but that's not the only way to make these connections. That's the one thing I want to highlight because there's a felt sense there. It might show up as an image, it might show up as a thought process or a schema, it might show up as a, nervous system automatic response, but it's not the clinician who determines that, it's the individual that makes those connections. So once I'm able to integrate that experience, meaning I connect to, oh, this is the situation, this is what was going on, this was my age, these were my limitations, all of the puzzle pieces come together and my brain's able to allow it to be filed in a historical file rather than an active threat, then those responses change. So we look at all these as signals, right? So whenever an individual comes, if they have an over response, if they have a pattern that they get stuck in, if there's even like nightmares or flashbacks, those are all signals that there's something in there that is needing to be integrated. When in a lot of the approaches that I was taught initially when I first started in this field were really attempts to outcompete this way of functioning. So there's different ways of changing. Yes, repetition can help to create a new habit. However, when it's the deep-rooted response comes from an experience of trauma, like a survival mechanism, you can't really outthink your nervous system. It's like it works until it doesn't. And this is what I would see with the kids that we worked with is like, as long as the environment supported this other way of being, they were okay. But the moment they went back to the same environment, they hadn't practiced being in a, rough neighborhood or those type of things. We controlled the environment. So they went back to those adaptive responses. So when some of these approaches, and yes, they are valuable, we're not diminishing the value of them, but it's not always complete. That's why as a clinician, any of you who have been in the field for a long time, you find an awesome tool and then you realize, oh, there's this other thing that I need help with. Let me go get trained in something somatic, or let me go get trained in something that'll really address these flashbacks or these patterns. And so what we were trying to do with CMI is like find that kind of that connecting thread that connects all of these. Our theory is really when we have these experiences, where it really impacts us is our capacity. The capacity to experience emotion, sensations, flexibility and cognition, our capacity for internal reflection, which helps you with making decisions and taking agency, our capacity for connection with ourselves and others. So we go into that in training the capacities, but what happens when we go into a survival response, especially at an early age, we might withdraw and see people as like threaten. They threaten my heart, so I'm just going to disconnect. And now that becomes part of my go-to, my adaptive response, and it can cause problems later on in life. So this is part of the thing that differentiates CMI, is that we're looking at the capacity building as well, but or um, recognizing what's inhibiting capacity. I guess it's those experiences. So how do we do that with CMI? It really is an internal process. We do provide like psychoeducation, so the individual understands like why they do what they do, kind of make sense of, well, this is what your nervous system does, and this is what it might think is going on. This is how your experiences impact it. But as we go and explore, we're not the ones telling them what to look for, right? We're teaching them to tune into that signal. And we do that through sensory emotion expansion. And this is one of the things that I believe like emotion focused therapy, or there's some approaches that do that as well. But this kind of differentiates CMI from a lot of other modalities, is that rather than trying to manage or regulate an emotion, we're teaching them to tune into it. And by creating parameters, so if somebody has a lot of, I call it like emotionally backed up, they've stuffed a lot, they could get overwhelmed very easily because everything's coming and hitting at once. And so we're teaching to put how to put parameters and just go one at a time. I call it a digestion process because that's kind of what an emotion does, right? It moves through. You have to experience it so that it can move out and move on. But it needs to be able to communicate what it needs to communicate, or else it's not going anywhere. It's going to get stuck. And so we teach individuals how to tune in through sensory emotion expansion, really explore, and how to connect, how to continue following that signal. Because what happens is that if you are able to allow that process to happen organically, it will naturally take you to what the individual needs. So it might be a critical memory that shows up as a scene, an experience. It might just be a felt sense. It might be like something somatic where there's a movement that didn't complete. There's many different ways where it can manifest, and so we're teaching the clinician how to tune into that and help the individual tune into that path. This whole process is really using memory reconsolidation. And some of you might be familiar with this concept of memory reconsolidation, but all that is how how the brain stores information. So when we go through an experience, it has to, take all the aspects of the experience, like what happened, how the person experienced it, what they saw, what they smelled, what they tasted, what they felt internally. And all of these little data points kind of create a network that light up like a memory trace network. And that is a memory. And then when they experience it again, it has to update. So think about what your memory of Christmas or a holiday is. As a kid, maybe it was magical. And then as you get older, you have all these other additional memories that go into that memory trace, right? That kind of shape it and give you new perspectives on it. And then you become an adult and you're like, I'm the one that has to make the magic. Like it changes the whole concept, went from something magical to like something that now it becomes your responsibility. And so our memories are always being updated. So it's not something that we facilitate, it's something that we utilize as a mechanism. And a lot of approaches, any trauma approach, this is really essentially how therapy works. It's just some approaches really take advantage of this process intentionally, and others it just kind of happens um, as like in the process. It's not as intentional. With CMI, we start with the clinician, focusing on the clinician's experience as a human being, and becoming curious about how their own experiences impact how they perceive the world, perceive themselves, their role as a clinician. And this is really important because when we talk about tuning into signals, we have to be really connected to ourselves so that we don't get our signals mixed up with the clients. And as you know, we talk about like transference, countertransference a lot in our field. But this stuff happens whether we're aware of it or not, because we look at the world, we listen autobiographically, and so we use our own experiences as a reference point, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so we start off with, helping the individuals, us as clinicians, becoming really aware of our own signals so that we can then know how to handle that and the other places this is one of the things that has changed for me, even though I've been a clinician for many years. The last couple of years when I started doing CMI, is I realized that there was things that I was doing, uh, limitations that I had in my practice that I didn't even know were there because I had unintegrated experiences that were lying beneath my conscious awareness. Meaning I didn't even realize they were a thing. I didn't have any symptoms of like, nightmares, flashbacks, avoidance, any of the things that you would like qualify as PTSD. But there was traumatic experiences that were shoved back in there that I was not really uh, integrated or really understanding how they impacted how I saw the world. And as I processed those, as I integrated those, it shifted how I heard the clients, like the things they were sharing with me. And all of a sudden I tuned into things that were I wasn't aware of before, with clients I'd been working for a couple of years. And so that was something that was surprising to me, that could be happening and we're not even aware that is happening. So this can lead to the misattunement. We might make an assumption about what's happening, and if the client's not aware, that can derail them from where they really need to go. Or sometimes, whenever we talked about like trying to facilitate this structure and it doesn't quite match the individual, it could lead to a rupture in that relationship, which can reinforce those attachment wounds. It's activate the individual. So with the CMI approach, what we've discovered, kind of the expected results, is this isn't just about alleviating the symptoms. The individual actually shifts the way they view themselves and how they interact and interpret the world's relationships, experiences. That to me is the exciting piece because it's something that it's really hard to conceptualize if you haven't experienced it, but you probably have with at least some clients that you've treated, where you realize those changes are dramatic and they just grow and blossom, and you're like, wow, I'm so proud of you. But my question was like, how do we do that more consistently? What is it that went right? How do we replicate this? And that's kind of what we were looking for with CMI. A couple of pivotal moments for me where I knew we were going in the right direction was, when a client who really struggled with self-hatred, had a lot of like complex trauma, talk about every, you know, all 10 aces, every trauma you can think of. And he came into my office, one day, sat down and said, I think I'm beginning to like myself. I thought this is huge. His perception of self. This was an individual who had struggled with addiction in the past. So there was a lot of guilt and self-hatred. And that individual also actually at the end of our work together, the day of discharge, he sat on my couch and he said, I actually welcome flashbacks now. And I about fell out my seat because I thought, what do you, can you explain to me what you just said? And he said at the beginning, because he had come to me because of flashbacks and nightmares, he said, I feel like now I know it's going to be uncomfortable. I know that it might be scary, but I also know I'm going to learn something about myself when that memory it went from something that activated him and siphoned him into the past to now just a memory that was unpleasant that he could look at, he could explore, and he could integrate on his own. And that to me was like, that was powerful because it's something I never thought I would hear in our field. But this is what happens is when you have a strong sense of self, you're able to look at those things. And we know that, when you have essentially treated like a trauma, they're able to look at it historical and not get activated as if it's happening right now. But to be able to do that, especially with complex trauma, when, I mean, pick a day, it was probably a trauma that happened. That's huge. That's huge. And that's what we mean by their capacity increases, their ability to experience discomfort, to experience the whole range of emotion and be able to still stay in control, not get kind of hijacked by it. And these are the things that we're seeing that's different. So I wanted to pause right there. Hopefully they gave you guys enough information about that, but give you some time to ask any questions that you might have about the process. And we do, just before we do that, because I do want to see your face a little bit larger. The foundations of CMI is the first step. It's a 2-day training. It's online, synchronous, meaning that we train live, and we do that just to kind of break it up, to give you some time to process and learn some of these concepts. And you do get to experience a CMI session yourself. You go over kind of the definitions, the verbiage, so you kind of have a structure, a reference point where everything else will fit in. And then the clinical applications is in person. And we do ask that you take that within, 4 to 6 weeks of the first initial one. So everything's still fresh enough. When you do the clinical applications, if you have enough individuals in your area, we can actually, work with you on scheduling something in your area. But we do hold them pretty frequently, like out in my area or in Tampa. Sometimes we hold some in Utah. But that's also a 2-day training. That's where we get into all the details of how do you facilitate this with an individual, especially if you work with complex trauma. How do you know that they're ready? How do you use this pattern, with certain whatever presenting problem the individual has. And so we really get more into the details of that in clinical applications. So I'm going to pause right there. So any of you have questions, or if anything was in the chat?
Yeah, thanks, Steph. There's some stuff in chat. Melinda is just kind of making some great observations and just responding to those in chat. Again, if any folks have questions, definitely
Yeah.
drop them there or speak up. We're here. I appreciate, Melinda, your observation about the way our nervous systems interact. We have a big emphasis on that concept in CMI.
Yes.
It's just so true and so necessary for the therapist to have a nervous system state that helps support and stabilize and performs and operates as a resource for the client as they're going through difficulty.
It's interesting you bring that up. I had a client just yesterday that walked in. He's a veteran. He said, "I haven't been honest with you." And I asked, "What do you mean?" He's like, "I didn't tell you why I really was referred to you." And it was that and he just had a lot of shame in sharing it, but it was
Mm,
that he'd been struggling with suicide ideation. And he was terrified to tell me because he was afraid that I was going to freak out and I was going to put him in the loony bin. And so, because I've worked with that a lot, I work with complex trauma, BPD. I have a lot of clients that are BPD, so it's not an uncommon thing. I don't freak out. I sit and get curious to really explore. It was just a different experience for him. I mean, I could see him visibly, his body shift and change, and the questions and the comments that he was sharing with me. And by the end of the session, he said, um, "This was so different. Thank you so much. Like just this something feels different to me." And I thought, how many times has this individual felt the clinicians like, stress about, oh no, I have someone that's high risk. And then that dictates the interaction. He already's carrying shame, guilt, all of these things, and it impacts their ability to really explore these things and connect with these things. So I love that you bring that up because even if I could put on the face of accepting and, try to like control my tone and sound non-judgmental, these things that are happening internally, my nervous system is giving off vibes whether I'm comfortable or not, and their nervous system is picking up on those vibes. So absolutely, these are the things that impact our sessions. Any questions that you have?
I have a quick question. So I don't know how often this has happened with you. Has there ever been situations where you're dealing with a client and they kind of think about a suppressed memory, but it may not be the memory that is the root cause of whatever issue you're addressing, and then you have to go even deeper? Like, how often does that happen?
Yeah, the memories will be activated throughout, but that's where we typically we're not deciding what the actual memory is. It kind of emerges organically, and that's what we teach in clinical applications is how to tune in. How do you know that you got to the actual critical memory? Because yeah, there's going to be connections that are made, and this is what would happen before if you ask a question like, have you experienced this before? So here's the signal, and they're like, well, yeah, I experienced it here and here, and they might go to those things because that's what you asked them to do, but that's not where the root is, right? So when we allow, and this is the piece that we teach is like invitation, and kind of holding those parameters, the brain will organically go through and will continue moving until it gets to the place that needs to be addressed. Now, the other piece to know is that networks, it's not like a clean, just this is a network and this is the one, core. All of them are interlinked as well. kind of like Spotify. You know how you do a Spotify playlist and it goes by like the beat or the
Mm-hmm.
artist or the style or the genre or whatever it is. So there may be different aspects that need to be processed or integrated. But we're just letting that emerge organically. You know, we're not pointing them there. We're teaching individuals to kind of attune to it as it goes through. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Anyone else? I hope that you have enough of an idea of like what CMI is. I know it's a really hard concept to like try to explain in 30 minutes time. But any questions that you guys have, especially in terms of your experience or anything that I said that might either connect or not make sense? None? Just because I'm an optimist, I'm going to take your silence as like you did great and it makes sense to me and I'm ready to sign up because this is what I do if I'm going to make up something in my head. Yeah. Right. So if there's nothing else, I mean, just know that we're happy to answer any questions, anything comes up. And Brian and I are pretty accessible too. Like if we like to chat about this stuff anyway. If you needed to call or say, hey, what about this or that. But also if you're ready to sign up, I know that Julia, for anyone who comes to this webinar, you get a discount code. She'll send you all the information afterwards.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah.
and if there's a time frame that works for you, it's best to probably look at when you could do the in-person for clinical application. If you really would rather something in your area, then we can wait and maybe you can invite others, to do a webinar to see if others will sign up so that we can get enough people signed up and come to you. Otherwise, we'll let you know what's available in terms of dates and then you can decide which foundations you take. Sometimes it's better to work backwards that way. You have that set up and you're not stuck with not knowing where to go.
Yeah.
I do have a question.
Sure, Melinda.
How well does this integrate, say with, I'm a big brain spotter. Do a lot of brain spotting that has a lot of these things.
Yes. You know what? That's what makes it beautiful. I mean, we'll have people who are like, well, I'm an EMDR clinician. This sounds just like it. I'm an IFS clinician. This sounds just like it. ART sounds just, that's the whole point of having something that is, that thread that connects all of these modalities. So it's not something that is meant to be just followed like a script. It's more like the pattern, and you just know more intentionally when the individual might be ready here, when you could use the brain spotting piece, right? Or when maybe you don't need it and you thought you would naturally, before. Like there's been so many times where I'm going through, I used to do ART, I was an ART trainer, and it's, there's protocol steps that you do, and you'd be doing the thing even though they didn't really need it. Now we can tune in and be like, okay, this is where the brain's already in the process. And it happens quicker when it's organic sometimes because I'm not slowing them down. So you will be able to definitely, it should make sense, with all the approaches that you already use and that you've learned. Hopefully it just allows you to expand your understanding and tune into other potential things that might be going on. And we give you tools for, we try to give a variety. We do have some recorded sessions. Unfortunately, the best ones are not the ones that are in studio, it's the ones that we do one-to-one. But definitely bring in case examples for how that critical memory might manifest. So you learn how to tune into that because it's not always a narrative. It's not always a scene or a story or an image. Sometimes there's a felt sense. Sometimes there's a metaphor. Sometimes it's a somatic experience. And being able to use the same, that pattern. How do you integrate this approach into that is kind of what we really focus on in clinical application.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I will send everyone some resources once we hop off the call, just so you have all that, the links to the upcoming training dates and all of that. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, guys.